Hey everyone, it's Snack from Crow's Nest, and I got some stats from the latest Deck Devastators tournament, Deck Devastators 9. It was an awesome tournament. Unfortunately, I was not able to get the grand finals on stream, but I do have a video that just went up the other day where I did cover that and all the top 16 deck lists. But in this video, I'm going to be going over all the stats like I usually do. I know people were begging for the stats immediately after the tournament ended, and here they are. So let's just get into it. The basic thing here is what decks were entered. So here we go. We had, as you can see here, 22% black, 22% Vayu Turbo, 15% Frog, 13% Blackwing. But I'll go through and say the exact numbers. So overall, we had 172 players, and 38 were Vayu Turbo, 27 Frog, 23 Blackwing, 16 Machina, 12 Gladiator Beast, 9 Lightsworn, 5 Fairy, 5 Zombie, 4 Amaryllis, 4 Diva Hero, 4 Hero Beat, 4 Quick Draw Plant, 3 Dragon Turbo, 3 Gigavize, 3 Synchro Cat, 2 Stun, 1 Battery Man, that was a crazy one, 1 Dragon, like not Dragon Turbo, 1 Flamvel, 1 Gemini, 1 Insect. We had 1 Kawaki Meru, 1 Monster Mash, 1 Neospatian, 1 Pac-Man deck, and 1 plant deck that was not any other kind of plant deck that has already been covered. So those were your decks that were entered. I also have a recent video on the channel where I talked about like rogue versus meta decks. Basically, I think it's the title of the video has something to do with if you want to meta game against, like, how good are hard counters in Edison against all that kind of stuff. So I did do that for this tournament too. I ran those numbers. Basically what these graphs are saying, if you just look at the vertical height over here on this layer chart, this yellow represents everything that isn't Blackwing, Frog, or Vayu Turbo. At the beginning of the tournament in round 1, the vertical height is pretty high, it's around 50%, and by the end it is less. So the longer the tournament goes, the more Blackwing, Frog, and Vayu Turbo you should expect to see. In fact, Vayu at the start goes from 22 to 31 by the end. Frog goes from 16 to 23 by the end. Blackwing goes from 13 to 12, so it stays the same. Whereas everything else goes from 49% to 35% by the end. So you can see that with the absolute numbers here in this bar chart where the yellow represents everything else. This graph is harder to explain. Go watch that other video if you want an explanation. Next, win percentages by deck type. So we had 5 zombie players enter and 2 of them topped. So for that reason, the low numbers, we have zombie looking insane here, but congrats to zombie. Everything else is pretty similar. I only am counting decks that had at least 5 entrants. And I think like sometimes you'll see a deck that just really ate it that weekend, and that doesn't seem to be the case this time. None of the decks with a high sample size super overperformed. You could say maybe zombies like took advantage of people not preparing for them anymore, but I think it might just be a sample size thing, so nothing crazy here in my opinion. And with this chart, it's some of the same. Both zombie and quick draw plant didn't have a lot of entrants, and they had people top with the decks. So, and this is only conversion rate into top 8 rather than top 16, I'm pretty sure. But something I do find interesting here is frogs compared to Vayu Turbo and Blackwing. As we saw on the first slide or the first sheet, all 3 of these decks, Blackwing, Vayu Turbo, and Frog, have pretty high entrance rates. But I think the reason for Frogs having a higher conversion rate is just that the really skilled players play Frog, and new players do not play Frog very much. Like, someone who's new to Edison is way more likely to play Vayu Turbo or Blackwing than they are to play like Fishborg Frogs or even Hero Frogs. So I think that's a big reason why they tend to have a higher conversion rate, because the people that enter with the deck are not going to be the half-hearted, I just learned about Edison and now I'm playing my first tournament ever. And that holds up because not only did frogs have a good conversion rate into top 8, they had a good conversion rate into top 16, and a lot of frog players just missed on the bubble. So there weren't, I mean, it seems like the frogs had a high proportion of players that did not just like immediately scrub out. So that's pretty interesting. I also, in a recent, I think last time I did one of these like post-tournament reviews, I looked at something I called card fixation, which is like how often you can expect to see a given card in a deck type. So 63, in this case, we looked at draw traps, Owie, and this time Shura. So draw traps in Blackwings, Owie, water out Owie in frog decks, and Shura in Vayu decks, actually. So we saw 63% of Blackwing decks ran a draw trap, and including the decks that didn't run them at all, on average, if you average all the Blackwing decks together, you would get about 1.5 draw traps per Blackwing deck. And then 29% of frog decks ran Owie, and 22% of the Vayu decks ran Shura. But if you look over here, they're averaging 0.21, which is almost the exact same thing, like divided by 10 here. So no one ran more than one Shura. There are 22% of Vayu decks ran Shura, but they all ran exactly one. But the Shura one is something that I thought was very interesting, and part of the reason why I did this analysis again. So as I actually went back to doing the deck by deck analysis, where I put in all the YDK files into a spreadsheet, and part of what motivated me to do this is that I wanted to actually look and compare the top 16 deck list to the next 16. I'll call them the bubble 16, right? So you have the top 16 and the bubble 16, and together they make up the top 32 after Swiss, right? And I wanted to see if I could find any differences between card usage in the top 16 versus the bubble 16. So maybe there's a card that you could put into your deck or take out of your deck that will give you a better chance to avoid the bubble and actually make it convert into the top 16. That's just the theory, at least, right? But important for that, actually, let's skip over here real quick. Important to take into context when we're talking about that are the decks that make up those. This should not say top 32. This should say bubble 32 or bubble 16 here. So let me just fix this real quick, just to make it clear to everybody. If you take a screenshot from this, we had in the top 16 there were Vayu, Frog, Blackwing, Zombie, yada yada yada. But the main differences here, they're fairly similar, but I would say the main differences here are that there were more frog decks in the bubble 16 than there were in the top 16, and 0 zombie here, 0 zombie in the bubble, both zombies converted. Anything else that was really Fairy and Amaryllis were in the bubble, but they didn't make top 16. So just keep in mind when I'm going to discuss the card specific choices, which decks make up the two populations, okay? But so what I did here was I threw all 16 deck lists, all however many cards that was, and all the bubble 16 here. And the main thing I decided to look at was the difference between the two. So here on the right side, the green cards are cards that were played more in the top 16 than they were in the bubble 16. And the red cards are the cards that were played less in the top 16 than they were in the bubble 16. So hopefully that makes sense to everybody. So let's go to an example here. I actually picked out 6 that I really want to talk about here, but Legacy of Yada, there were 4 decks that played Legacy of Yada in the top 16, and only 1 deck played Legacy of Yada in the bubble 16. So that sort of says something, right? And I don't think it's just the deck list. Let me actually triple check that, because maybe there's just way more Blackwing in the top 16, but there were 2 Blackwing in the bubble 16 and 3 in the top 16. So the decks in the top 16 chose to play Legacy of Yada, and they had more success than the same Blackwing decks that didn't in the bubble 16. I think that's kind of interesting data right there, but maybe I'm crazy. So it's not just a difference in the deck choices, it's actually a difference in the card selections within that deck archetype. So yeah, we had four decks that played Yada and 8 total copies, whereas in the bubble there were only 1 deck and they only played 1 copy. So it's like, okay, maybe Legacy of Yada needs to be played more in Blackwing decks. That'll help you convert. Maybe. That's just, you know, an idea. Trap Stun is another card. 4 decks in the top 16 played some copies of Trap Stun. Only 1 deck in the bubble 16 played Trap Stun, but it did play 3 copies. So that person did seem to be on the spice. They knew what they were doing, playing 3 copies, but they were the only one that got the memo. Whereas in the top 16, 4 people knew to do it. And then here's one that I think tells a story, that being Nobleman of Crossout. So Nobleman of Crossout, 4 decks in top 16 were playing Nobleman, which is funny because I feel like that's not a card that's not a super common card in the meta, I think, but a lot of people picked it for this event, and 0 people in the bubble 16 were playing Nobleman, but we had 5 copies in the top 16. Now, maybe you're saying, okay, Nobleman is a great card, but I think it might actually tell a different story. I think the story that this tells is one of the cards that had was most present in the bubble and not in the top 16 was Raikou. And so if you look, in the bubble 16, 10 different decks were playing Raikou, whereas in the top 16, only 4 decks were playing Raikou. And I think what this is saying is the decks that were in top 16 used Nobleman on the bubble decks and maybe kept them from getting in. Like, it's very possible that some of these players that made it into top 16 got there because they beat someone here in the bubble with Nobleman on Raikou. Like, is that crazy to think? Like, that might be just the story that the data is telling here. But I also think Raikou generally is kind of falling out of favor because you have Deck Devastation virus everywhere, and with decks like Gigavice does not care about Raikou. Fishboard Frogs does not care about Raikou very much. Like, it's just kind of a little bit of a slow card at this point. And yeah, especially if people are going to bring in Nobleman now. That's just kind of crazy. So, and something else I wanted to point out. We only had 4 decks playing Raikou, and that's with people still playing Vayu, still playing Quick Draw, still playing Machina, right? But I don't think any of those decks were playing Raikou. They were playing Machina without Raikou, Vayu without Raikou, and Quick Draw without Raikou. Just for example, if you're curious about some of these deck lists, you can check out the other video, but here's GBO playing Quick Draw without Raikou, and here's Cam Neal playing Vayu without Raikou. So the decks that were able to convert and avoid bubbling were those that cut Raikou. And I think that's pretty interesting. Now, there was some Raikou in top 16, but it's just like a general trend that I found interesting. Did I cover everything here? Also, yeah, there's also more frogs in the bubble than there were in the top 16, and still the bubble had more Raikou. So it's not just a deck choice thing, because, you know, frogs usually won't play Raikou, and there were tons of frogs in the bubble, but the bubble still had more Raikou than the top 16. Okay, I'm done saying the word Raikou. Is that right? Oh yeah, and just to also make this clear, there was only 1 Raikou sided in the top 16. So this isn't just a case of Blackwing deck siding Raikou. There's only 1 that was siding it. Anyways, another card that was down, like the ones that converted were not playing it as much, was Chimera Tech Fortress Dragon. So there were 9 decks that played Chimera Tech Fortress Dragon in the top 16, and 13 that played it in the bubble. So this is a card that sometimes you would cut, and I think part of the reason for this is we had like Hybrid Blackwing, I think, maybe cut this card because of a pretty crowded extra deck, and I think it's possible. I know at least one of the zombie decks cut this card, so it's a little bit of a factor that the decks that were in the top 16 were those that couldn't afford the extra space to dedicate to Chimera Tech Fortress Dragon. But I think there also might be something here saying that, like, okay, well, having the extra deck optionality and not needing Fortress Dragon is kind of valuable, and also not dedicating your side deck space to the Cyber Dragon potentially. So something to keep in mind, that this was also a card that, I don't want to say it underperformed, but it was less represented in the top 16 than you might expect. And lastly was Consecrated Light. I think this one is an interesting one. It was played more in the bubble than it was in the top 16. And I wonder if this is just a case of the people in the bubble tried to stop the dark decks and Consecrated Light just wasn't enough. Because we did have, Blackwing Vayu make it in the top 16. And I think maybe Consecrated, the Blackwing players are able to use Deck Dev. They're able to use Icarus. In a lot of the cases of people like Consecrated Light, sometimes it's people splashing it into a deck that isn't like a light deck. And it's like, it's a little bit underwhelming if you can't, I think this might show that Consecrated Light should be more of a deck specific thing. Like, I'm going to play Consecrated in Fairy or in Lightsworn, and not necessarily just throwing Consecrated in anything, but it's that's maybe a little bit too much to declare off of just some numbers, but yeah. And if we go by, just in case you're curious, I'll sort here just so you can take a screenshot if you're interested. These are some of the cards. I think at the top here we do have like Bottomless, Mirror Force, Solemn Judgment, but once again I think some of these cards are only here because of the deck types chosen. Frog decks aren't going to be playing these, and there was more Frog in the bubble 16, so I don't think that these is like super telling that like you should play these cards, and if you don't, you're throwing. I think it's just like, you have to keep in mind. Same thing with Deep Sea Diva. Deep Sea Diva was like super way more common in the top 16. Every deck that played Deep Sea Diva was in the top 16, but that's because we just happen to have a Diva Frog, and we happen to have 2 Diva Zombie decks. Anyway, on to the deck specific breakdown. Here's Blackwing. Let me do one of these real quick. We had overall 23 Blackwing decks, and 19 of them were playing a standard version. 3 of them were on like a hybrid, and one of them was like a Harpy Blackwing. I don't know if you can read those win rates, but they're all around 50. For fairies, we actually had no like recruiter fairy decks. We had 3 Ritual and 2 Valhalla. I personally think we had 1 Ritual on the bubble actually. I think the Ritual fairy deck is very good. Personally, Rituals had a 61% win rate, Valhalla 33. Frog decks. We had a lot of different frog decks. We had 16 hero frogs, 6 Fishborg frogs, 2 Fishborg hero, 1 Junk Monarch, 1 Diva frog, and 1 Machina frog. It was also on Gear Town stuff. So yeah, all the win rates are pretty good. The Diva frog obviously really good because we had 1 player, and it was Ronok who topped with it. Yeah. You can probably read these if you look really close. Zoom in. The Gladiator Beast, we had 12. There's not really... Overall, Glads, according to this, had a 38% win rate, which seems low. Let me triple check that, actually. Let me triple check this. Did they really have a 38% win rate? That doesn't sound right. Bear with me here. I'm doing some live calculating here. So we had 24 and 53. That seems closer. Sorry, everybody. Yeah, these are just carried over from the last event, probably. Okay, they had a 45% win rate. I knew that was not correct. Lightsworn. We had Chaos or Twilight, whatever you want to call it, 4 of those. 2 Fairy / Christiasworn, whatever you prefer to call that. 2 Pure Lightsworn and 1 Vayu-sworn. Once again, they're all pretty good. Actually, Pure did the worst with a 38% win rate, but the others were around 50. For the Machina decks, we had 6 Standard Machina, 5 Hero Machina, 3 Jinzo Machina, and then 1 Ancient Gear Machina, 1 Machina Gadget. Jinzo, the 3 Jinzo decks did not do great. They had a 25% win rate. Ancient Gear Machina, 75% win rate with 1 player, that being Pana, who topped. And yeah, the Gadget player won 1 game and then, they lost 1 game and dipped, I think. For Vayu, we had 33 standard value, something that, imagine the Sizzle 41 in your head, it was close to that. And then we had 3 Norlaris value, 1 Nitro value, which top, that was Cam Neal, and 1 like Value Sworn deck. And yeah, Value Sworn only 33% win rate, Norlaris only 36% win rate. As we said, Nitro value did very well, and standard was around 50%. Whenever you get the high numbers, that's when it kind of converges to around 50. And then lastly, for zombie decks, we had 2 Psychic zombies, 1 Diva Hero zombies, 1 Diva without Hero zombies, and 1 Zombie Gadget, which is a cool idea, I thought. Psychics were at 50% win rate. Diva Hero did not lose a single game in Swiss. Diva Hero zombie, that is. And the Diva zombie had a 75% win rate in Swiss. So yeah, that's pretty much most of the information that I put together here. I do think this page is the most interesting this time. Let's throw these on here. I think these 6 cards here, Yada, Nobleman, Trapstun, Consecrated, Chimeritic Fortress, and Raiko were the ones that were most interesting, especially Raiko. I think that's a card that was kind of like a not icon, I guess icon of the format, or an emblematic of the format. And so it's very interesting to see that the decks that were able to convert into top 16 were those that have kind of cut down on Raikos, even in decks that traditionally do play the card. And maybe some of that is just like, for this specific event, it caught people off guard. They're expecting to have to play around Raiko. Maybe the top 16 players are setting monsters, and the opponent says, okay, well, I'm playing against Vayu, this set monster has to be Raiko. Or I'm playing against Quick Draw, this set monster must be Raiko. And it's just not. So, but maybe in the future, if you stick with this trend, it won't be as, you know, replicable. Who knows? But I thought the data was pretty interesting. And let me know in the comments what part of this video you found the most interesting. You know, if you are interested in looking at the deck lists, that video should be linked somewhere. But adios.